This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing and concluding my conversation with Leuren Moret and Christina Consolo about Fukushima. I really am at your disposal because the two of you are the experts. I know we want to address the 28 indications that that the West Coast is being fried with nuclear radiation, but I leave it to your discretion as to how we shall proceed. Leuren?
We have links to, we have this article and other articles. We'll send it all to you, and you can weave it into the interview.
Yes, well, Bill Fox, to whom I'm very indebted for arranging these interviews, will be preparing transcripts of our conversations for publications as articles in Veterans Today, and he would be very pleased to include the links to any articles you want to add, Leuren, and of course any graphics you want to provide for the publication in VT.
Sure. Okay, Christina, how about if we each read one of these 28 signs on the Pacific coast of North America?
Sure.
So the first one, which we mentioned already, is polar bears, seals, and walruses along the Alaska coastline suffering from fur loss and open sores, and that's also been reported in the moose population. There's a big moose die-off from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic along the Canadian-U.S. border. So you go ahead and do number two.
Number two was the epidemic of sea lion deaths along the California coastline. But I also want to mention that they had an unusual event as far down as San Diego this year, where seal pups were being abandoned in much greater numbers than what the rescues were used to seeing. And they still don't have an explanation about why these seal pups were abandoned. They were all underweight, and some of them have been rehabilitated and put back into nature. But these events are really escalating. They're moving right up the coast.
Could it be that from the evolutionary point of view, the seal population, the mothers recognize when they have offspring that aren't likely to be capable of sustaining their way, and therefore they abandon them early to not invest more maternal resources in their upbringing when their prospects are so slender?
Yeah, that's a definite possibility.
The other thing that happens is that when a population is put under stress, and the young are affected the most by toxins and so forth, and it weakens them and they can't keep up with the mothers, or they get lost or left behind. The mothers just can't take care of them or find them when they come back to where they thought they were. So 45% of the pups born in June have died in Southern California along the coast. That's a very high death rate. It's the same as the infant mortality. And when you see phenomena occurring in humans and in animal populations, it has to be an environmental cause.
Yeah, it's all profoundly disturbing.
Continue. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, so did you have anything else to say, Christina?
No, I did try to track someone down at NOAA to comment on the seal mortality and what was found in terms of the testing for radioactive materials, because Enenews had reported over a year ago that they did find radiation in the seals, but that it wasn't above what they expected it to be for normal background. However, they never indicated if it was cesium or strontium or what they tested for and what the levels were. And when I tried to call NOAA to pin somebody down with this, I got such a runaround. In fact, some of it I did on air on my show, and we kept getting sent to David Kelly, and then I would call David Kelly and say, oh, you want the David Kelly in Hawaii. And then I would call him, and they would send me to someone else. And what I found out was that they actually carved up these seals and sent them to 20 different labs for testing. You know, they sent the whiskers to one lab, and they sent the teeth to another lab, and they sent the skin from the dorsal area to another lab. And so, I mean, they're kind of doing, it's like the Manhattan Project, but in
Same
reverse.
thing. It's the same thing.
Where they divide up all the information, knowing these people probably won't talk to each other and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's what they're doing. So number 3 is that along the Pacific coast of Canada and the Alaska coastline, the population of sockeye salmon is at a historic low. Many are blaming Fukushima, and certainly this woman, she's a professional biologist, has fundraised and done a study on the salmon in British Columbia, in the Fraser River and other rivers. And this is an area where a large orca population will summer. The resident orcas that live in a particular area, they come and migrate and spend the whole summer there, and they usually arrive with new baby orcas, so they're feeding them too. They live on salmon populations. The other orcas that are called transient populations, they live on marine sea mammals, and they travel in groups of 3 so that they're quiet and they can sneak up on the sea mammals, seals and stuff. And so they have very different diets, and we're going to see the effects of the radiation and the difference in the diet in these populations over time. And I predict that the coastal salmon, the resident populations, are going to have a more severe impact because the salmon are going out in the Pacific. They're eating smaller fish. It bioconcentrates the radiation. And we just have to wait and see. But this woman who did the study and independently raised the money to have these salmon lab analyzed, they have very severe viruses, and that indicates immune system damage, as well as a slimy starfish goo. The starfish are just kind of melting along the North Pacific coast.
Oh, God.
And then the jellyfish also. So that really sounds like a viral infection or some kind of a bacterial viral slime on them.
But, the exposure to radiation will affect their immune systems or their capacity to cope with otherwise, threats to their environment they might normally be able to deal with, and therefore make them far more vulnerable to these kinds of diseases and related problems.
Number 4 was something is causing fish all along the west coast of Canada to bleed from their gills, bellies, and eyeballs. I mean, bleeding and bruising is a hallmark of radiation exposure. I'm sure there's mutations of viruses and bacteria that could be making these fish sick. They're indicating from this article that it's in multiple species. Now, I did call several fisheries over the last few days in Canada, one in the Great Lakes region, Purdy's, and another in the Vancouver area. And both of the people that I spoke to at those fisheries were very forthcoming. They all knew about Fukushima. They knew that there was a potential for it to be affecting their catches. They did report from both the Great Lakes region and from BC that they're experiencing lows in their catch. Nothing historic, but that it was kind of across the board. But neither organization had noted any increase of disease. And when I asked them who's testing the fish for radiation, they said that that wasn't their job. That happened after the fish leave their marketplace.
After the fish leave their marketplace.
Yeah. So I'm not
So they're getting into the food chain for the human population, and only then they're going to be tested? Not likely, because the retailers are going to want to market it and make their profit. I mean, no one cares about the health of the consumer.
Well,
Right.
they don't just balkanize countries, they balkanize the media too. So that's what's happening.
It all needs to be tested, and Leuren had brought up in an interview that she did last week with Alfred Weber that, I mean, there's a serious economic impact to this disaster that we're just now starting to realize, and obviously it's going to be, you know, affecting the fishing industry pretty severely.
Just as has happened in the Gulf Coast from the BP disaster. I mean, it's just wiped out whole industries there. It's
But what
Right.
they're doing is they're out there fishing like mad. They're scraping the bottom. They have these huge nets that are a mile wide. They're just taking everything indiscriminately, and feeding it, and turning it in, counting it, freezing it, and turning it into human food. This is just how they spread the radiation everywhere. They want everyone exposed. Just exactly what they're doing in Japan by burning radioactive trash all over Japan. Number 5 is a vast field of radioactive debris from Fukushima that is approximately the size of California or Texas, as crossing the Pacific Ocean. It's already crossed and it's starting to collide with the West Coast.
that's
So
stunning. That's stunning.
that's right. And there's a very good article, October 18th, by Greg Ray in the Herald newspaper in Australia. It's called "The Ocean is Broken." And this is by a sailor who made many trips, yacht races across the Pacific. And what he's saying now, he sailed his boat from Osaka to San Francisco recently. He said, quote, "The next leg of the long voyage was from Osaka to San Francisco. And for most of that trip, the desolation was tinged with nauseous horror and a degree of fear." He said, "After we left Japan, it felt as if the ocean itself was dead. We hardly saw any living things. We saw one whale, sort of rolling helplessly on the surface with what looked like a big tumor on its head. It was pretty sickening. I've done a lot of miles on the ocean in my life, and I'm used to seeing turtles, dolphins, sharks, and big flurries of feeding birds. But this time, for 3,000 nautical miles, there was nothing alive to be seen. In place of the missing life was garbage in astounding volumes. In a lot of places, we couldn't start out our motor for fear of entangling the propeller in the massive pieces of rope and cable. That's an unheard of situation out in the ocean. If we did decide to motor, we couldn't do it at night, only in the daytime, with a lookout on the bow watching for rubbish. On the bow, in the waters above Hawaii, you could see right down into the depths. I could see that the debris isn't just on the surface, it's all the way down. And it's all sizes, from a soft drink bottle to pieces the size of a big car or truck. We saw a factory chimney sticking out of the water with some kind of boiler thing still attached below the surface. We saw a big container type thing just rolling over and over on the waves. We were reeving around these pieces of debris. It was like sailing through a garbage pile.
Unbelievable.
That is reality. That is what is happening.
Number 6, it is being projected that the radioactivity off coastal waters off the U.S. West Coast could double over the next 5 to 6 years.
I'll bet sooner.
I think that's being pretty generous. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's going to happen sooner,
That's
and
much
there's
too conservative.
many different things that need to be taken into account. How much radioactivity might be carried from this debris. Much of it is porous, cloth and styrofoam and wood that's going to collect particles that have been raining out over the past 2.5 years. And then we also have a situation of uranium buckyballs, and now the newest finding, cesium buckyballs. That was just reported today. Leuren can explain a little bit more about that, but we don't know how those things travel in the ocean waters.
Yes, scientists are reporting that spheres of radioactive material from Fukushima are being reported for the first time. Ball-like particles composed of cesium, iron, zinc, solid and insoluble in water. Impact on human health needs to be examined. What they're talking about are nanoparticles, and they are produced, these spherical particles. I know all about this because depleted uranium is just like this. And this indicates, since these are being reported now, very recently, as a new phenomenon, it means that the fuel rods are burning in Fukushima at extremely high temperatures. It means there's no water in the pools or some of the pools. And what happens at these very high temperatures is that they're so high, the burning fuel rods it release a gas, a very hot gas, that condenses and collects as a spherical radioactive particle when the very hot gas begins to chill. That indicates that Fukushima fuel rods are definitely burning at extremely high temperatures, and that was not reported right after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. So that place is going in flames and releasing extremely radioactive, very, very dangerous spherical nanoparticles of mixed radioactive isotopes. And those tiny spheres are extremely dangerous because they have an effect called the particulate effect. They actually change chemicals and interfere with cell processes that are life-threatening and cause very high rates of various illnesses caused by ionizing radiation. But there is our proof right there that Fukushima is on fire.
Unbelievable.
I have a question. Leuren, have you ever heard of this type of nanoparticle before in a reactor accident?
No, but
I hadn't either.
No, I haven't either, but it's definitely a characteristic of depleted uranium, from the battlefield. Uranium is a pyrophoric metal. It catches on fire very, very easily, and it burns at temperatures up to 5,000 degrees centigrade, which is hotter than the sun. So these tiny particles are the most lethal part of the danger of a nuclear power plant burning or using depleted uranium weapons. And of course, we know at Fukushima that they have MOX fuel in one of the reactors. That's mixing plutonium and uranium in the fuel, and it's very unstable, and it burns at very high temperatures. And of course, plutonium is extremely lethal to living organisms.
Number 7, experts have found very high levels of cesium-137 in plankton living in the waters of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and the West Coast.
Oh, that isn't normal, huh?
Well, they detected 2 weeks after the accident already very high levels in the kelp off BC. And at that time it was iodine-131, I believe, which after 40 days dissipates, but 129 sticks around for much longer. I have an article called The Bioaccumulation of Contamination in Plankton. This is from the U.S. Armed Forces in 1955. Plankton concentrate mineral elements from the water, and it has been found that radioactivity may be concentrated in this manner by as much as 1,000 times. Thus, for example, 1 gram of plankton could contain 1,000 times as much radioactivity as a gram of water adjacent to it.
Unreal.
And I believe we know even more now than we did back then. But I mean, this is bad news for anything in the ocean that lives on plankton, which is everything. But things that feed directly on it, like whales, for instance.
It's the base of the food chain. And what we know is about bioaccumulation in seaweed is that seaweed bioconcentrates ionizing radiation in the seawater to 150,000 times higher levels in seaweed than in the water the seaweed is living in.
Unbelievable.
So number
8
is one test in California found that 15 out of 15 bluefin tuna were contaminated with radiation from Fukushima. That was just about a year ago when tuna off the coast of San Diego were sampled, and I think all of them had cesium in the flesh, and these tuna had come from Japan, which is where they spawn offshore from Fukushima.
Yeah, number 9 ties into that too. Back in 2012, the Vancouver Sun reported cesium-137 being found in a very high percentage of the fish that Japan was selling to Canada. 73% of the mackerel tested, 91% of the halibut, 92% of the sardines. Of course, now the sardines from here have disappeared. 93% of the tuna and eel, 94% of the cod and anchovies, and 100% of the carp, seaweed, shark, and monkfish.
100%.
100%, and that is because the levels in these different fish depend on their diet. So fish that prey on other fish usually have lower levels than fish that feed on plankton, for instance, or they're bottom feeders, and they pick up mud and small particles which have higher levels of radiation because of the chemical affinity that tiny particles have for radiation. In other words, very tiny clay particles in water are they are scavengers for highly charged radioactive particles. 10. Canadian authorities are finding extremely high levels of nuclear radiation in certain fish samples. And that's some fish samples they tested have very high levels of radiation. One sea bass sample collected in July, for example, had 1,000 becquerels. That means disintegrations per second per kilogram of cesium. Now, the terrible thing about cesium is that it affects the heart. It is collected in the heart, and the heart produces new cells only about 5% per year. So we're seeing athletes, racehorses, celebrities during performance, pilots while they're flying are collapsing, they're dying of heart attacks or cardiac failure, and this is being very widely reported in the U.S. and Alaska flight crews, and also in England in football players, racehorses. It's that's the cesium damage. Now, what people don't realize is that nearly 2,000 radioactive isotopes are produced in a fissioning process. And that's what's coming out of burning and coming out of the fuel rods. So you have to multiply the danger of the cesium they're reporting by almost 2,000 other isotopes. We're getting absolutely bombarded.
If I pick up on number 11, people developing cancer from eating contaminated fish, what I'm stunned by this is that it seems to be having such a rapid effect. I mean, here we have this Daniel Hirsch, a nuclear policy lecturer at UC Santa Cruz, who's telling Global Security Newswire we could have large numbers of cancer from ingestion of fish, and I take it they're already showing up.
It's already showing up.
I mean, how quickly, it's just astonishing that it should be that fast.
Well, part of the problem too is that when you look back at Chernobyl, in Japan they're saying right now all these kids that they're finding thyroid problems with, they're developing nodules, some of them have early cancer. The experts are saying, wow, well, this can't be from Fukushima because it's happening too fast. Because in Chernobyl, it took 4 or 5 years for 100 kids to have cancer.
Well, it's these very tiny particles, and it's constant exposure now for 2 years, more than 2 years. And Fukushima, Chernobyl was just one exposure, and they put the lid on it, they put a sarcophagus on it and stopped it. This is constant daily 24-hour-a-day releases of low-level and not so low-level radiation. And by April of 2011, just 2 months after Fukushima, air samples and air filters in cars were analyzed by Dr. Chris Busby, and he calculated that by April, the radiation concentrations in the air in Japan around the Fukushima area indicated that the equivalent of 300 Chernobyls had occurred. We're talking now, from this new evidence about spherical particles, we're talking about all those fuel rods or large numbers of fuel rods in the cooling pools that are now empty, are releasing huge new amounts of extremely toxic sphericals.
Unbelievable.
So it's really bad, and a new study by the Food Lab and Radiation Food Lab, I believe it's in Japan, they reported that the 19th of October 2013 that Pacific Coast seaweed is contaminated with cesium, and that the levels are 8.14 becquerels per kilo for cesium-134, 8.88 becquerels per kilo for cesium-137, and cobalt is even being reported in seaweed off the Pacific coast of the U.S. At 3.7 becquerels per kilo. In Chima, which is north, it's between Tokyo and Fukushima, the cesium levels were 41 becquerels per kilo for cesium-134, 63 becquerels per kilo for cesium-137, although no cobalt-60 was detected. But there's nothing to compare this to. You can't even compare it to Chernobyl. It's the fuel, the spent fuel rods did not burn at Chernobyl. It was just the reactor rods, and they stopped it right away. But these people in Japan are releasing, they're guaranteeing, they're facilitating increased releases of extremely high levels of radiation on a daily basis into the atmosphere and into the ocean. And of course, contaminated air masses are over here along the Pacific coastline in a matter of days.
Number 12 is the BBC News recently reported radiation levels around Fukushima are 18 times higher than previously believed. And, you know, again, it's TEPCO's numbers, which are always revised higher. And with the last few weeks where we've had kind of this escalation of events, one of the things that I found really curious is that because of a wall that was built underground to block the corium from going out into the sea, or highly contaminated water going out into the sea, effectively they've dammed up the site so that the ground is now becoming saturated. And if you have this underground, you know, corium lava field, under the reactors, you have groundwater that's flowing through the site, and you have water that's continuously being poured on the reactors, and they're only collecting 300 or 400 tons of that a day. I think what we're going to see eventually is that this corium groundwater combination is going to be coming up around the site, and at that point workers aren't going to be able to be there. There's no way to protect them, especially from tritium, because tritium will go through everything. So, you know, they're really under the gun for anything that they need to do, and you know, they're going to cycle through workers continuously. There's no way to keep people on the site for long term with the kind of exposures they're getting with these numbers that we're seeing.
Leuren, how about 15, 16, 17?
At this point, 300 tons of contaminated water is pouring into the Pacific Ocean from Fukushima every single day, and that's because Japan is an island arc. The nuclear plants are built on the coastline so they can use seawater, huge amounts of water every day to cool the reactors. And the runoff from the volcanic spine of Japan is running right down to the coastline, and it's washing straight through Fukushima in that location, and just carrying, it's a constant river of radioactive water washing into the sea. Number 16, a senior researcher of marine chemistry at the Japan Meteorological Agency's Meteorological Research Institute says that, quote, 30 billion becquerels of radioactive cesium and 30 billion becquerels of radioactive strontium are being released into the Pacific Ocean from Fukushima every single day. And I bet it's a lot more than that. Number 17, according to TEPCO, a total of somewhere between 20 trillion and 40 trillion becquerels of radioactive tritium. Radioactive tritium is it's radioactive water, basically, have gotten into the Pacific Ocean since the Fukushima disaster first began.
Christina, 18, 19, 20.
According to a professor at Tokyo University, 3 gigabecquerels of cesium-137 are flowing into the port at Fukushima Daiichi every single day. Again, that's just one isotope. It's just cesium-137. Number 19, it's been estimated that up to 100 times as much nuclear radiation has been released into the ocean from Fukushima than was released during the entire Chernobyl disaster. Leuren just covered that when she talked about Chris Busby's air filter studies. And
that's an underestimation.
Yeah.
20.
20 is one recent study concluded that a very large plume of cesium-137 from the Fukushima disaster will start flowing into U.S. coastal waters early next year. Ocean simulations showed the plume of radioactive cesium released by the Fukushima disaster could begin flowing into the U.S. coastal waters starting early 2014 and peak in 2016. And again, there's so many unknowns.
It's going to kill the ocean. It absolutely is, the coastline.
Leuren, go to 21 and 22.
Okay, 21, it is being projected that significant levels of cesium-137 will reach every corner of the Pacific Ocean by the year 2020. That's because the ocean is very dynamic, and that stuff is spread all over very rapidly, but not as rapidly as in the atmosphere. 22, it is being projected that the entire Pacific Ocean will soon have cesium levels 5 to 10 times higher than what we witnessed during the era of heavy atomic bomb testing in the Pacific many decades ago. That's going to absolutely kill the fish populations.
Christina, 23, 24.
The immense amounts of nuclear radiation getting into the water in the Pacific has caused environmental activist Joe Martino to issue the following warning: your days of eating Pacific Ocean fish are over. I mean, mine were over 2 years ago.
Smart. You were ahead of the curve.
24 is the iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90 that are constantly coming from Fukushima are going to affect the health of those living in the northern hemisphere for a very, very long time. Just consider what Harvey Wasserman had to say about this. Iodine-131, for example, can be ingested into the thyroid where it emits beta particles that damage tissue. A plague of damaged thyroids has already been reported by as many as 40% of the children in the Fukushima area. That percentage can only go higher. In developing youngsters, it can stunt both physical and mental growth. Among adults, it causes a wide range of ancillary ailments, including cancer. Cesium-137 has been found in fish caught as far away as California. It spreads throughout the body but tends to accumulate in the muscles. Strontium-90's half-life is around 29 years. It mimics calcium and goes to our bones.
Leuren, 25 and 26.
25. According to a recent Planet InfoWars report, the California coastline is being transformed into a dead zone. The California coastline is becoming like a dead zone. And if you go to the beach, you will see that the rocks are unnaturally clean. There's hardly any kelp, barnacles, sea urchins anymore.
Killing all the microscopic forms of life.
Yes, and the tide pools are similarly devoid of crab, snails, and other scurrying signs of life. In other words, these filter feeders that are taking in very high levels and bioconcentrating them are just not able to survive. And especially compared to 10 to 15 years ago when, you had to wear tennis shoes if you went to the beach, or you'd cut the heck out of the bottom of your feet. Life is being exterminated. The ocean is going extinct.
Unbelievable.
And then it's carried into the Atlantic Ocean, and it will happen there, in the Arctic Ocean, and around the Antarctic. They're killing the entire global oceans.
26.
26 is a study conducted last year came to the conclusion that radiation from the Fukushima disaster could negatively affect human life along the west coast of North America from Mexico to Alaska for decades.
Leuren, 27.
According to the Wall Street Journal, it's being projected that the cleanup of Fukushima could take up to 40 years to complete. It's never going to stop releasing in our lifetimes.
I agree. 28, Christina.
Yale professor Charles Perrow is warning that if the cleanup of Fukushima is not handled with 100% precision, that humanity could be threatened for thousands of years. And he is referring to the fuel extraction in part, which is scheduled to start in 15 days from reactor 4. They actually are currently moving the fuel from reactor 6 into the common spent fuel pool. Now, they began that in mid-October, but it took them 3 weeks just to pry off the reactor lid in reactor 6, and that reactor was supposed to be fine. It didn't have any damage that was reported, and if they found anything once they got inside that reactor, they haven't talked about it, but they're currently moving that fuel, and they're going to be moving the fuel from number 4 at the same time and around the end of November.
In the minutes we have that remain, I'd like your concluding reflections, Christina.
Well, I think this is an issue of enormous complexity, and it's difficult to really wrap your mind around it, even if you do nothing else but read about this problem day after day. And I know many people that have. Fukushima's changed their lives because they realized right from the beginning the magnitude of the disaster. And for people who are kind of overwhelmed by this, it's the only thing you have to remember is that all radiation is bad, and everything that you can do to eliminate it in your daily life is good for the long run because it's cumulative, and you kind of have to treat yourself like you're already a cancer patient and get lots of sleep and eat well and pay attention to the people who are talking about this, because it really is probably the most important issue that we've ever faced.
Leuren, summing up in a sentence or two.
Well, the effects of these nuclear technologies that have been introduced one after another, it's actually resulted in a very strange phenomenon, and that is that the oldest people in the U.S., the seniors and those over 60, are the healthiest part of the U.S. population now. And the younger populations are having worse and worse health histories and health effects. And as time goes on and they become adults, all that exposure in the womb is expressed later on in their health. And the highest increase in death rates after Fukushima was reported in basically are the soldiers who returned to Texas from the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. They're the most exposed. They're already carrying a body burden that's almost killed them. And that little bit of Fukushima radiation just was the last straw. And so
Leuren Moret and Christina Consolo, I can't thank you enough for being here on The Real Deal with me, even though what you're telling us is overwhelming, depressing, even catastrophic. I can't thank you enough.